Morning all. He has been away from the spotlight since losing the presidential election. But last night, Donald Trump was back with a bang and a big hint that he may consider running for president in 2024. In what was his first major address since leaving office, he launched a number of scathing attacks on President Biden and repeated those false claims that last year's presidential election was rigged. Alistair Bunkle reports now from Orlando in Florida.
It is 39 days since we last heard from Donald Trump, and boy, have his supporters missed him. The former president has had 5.5 weeks to stew on defeat and consider his future. He might have left the White House, but he isn't leaving politics.
Biden has failed in his #1 duty as chief executive, enforcing America's laws. This alone should be reason enough for Democrats to suffer withering losses in the midterms and to lose the White House decisively 4 years from now. Actually, as you know, they just lost the White House, but it's one of those things. But who knows? Who knows? I may even decide to beat them for a third time, okay?
Trump had points to make, scores to settle, and old mistruths to peddle.
We have a very sick and corrupt electoral process that must be fixed immediately. This election was rigged, and the Supreme Court and other courts didn't want to do anything about it.
By rights, after losing the election by 7 million votes and having been impeached for a second time, Trump's political career should be dead and buried. But it's not. Just look at this.
In the end, he took his supporters right to the edge, but stopped just short of announcing his candidacy in 2024. But what is clear is that the Republican Party is still Trump's party, and anybody who got in his way will be made to pay for it.
Trump supporters are galvanised by a misplaced sense of injustice, and it works in his favour.
There was all love.
God, it was like the best time I've had in months.
Yeah. No, he's the greatest president we've ever had.
I'm inspired, recharged our batteries, we're ready to go take on the battle and finish what President Trump started.
Will he run in 2024? What do you reckon?
You really are asking that question?
I hope to see him before that.
He's running.
Trump is playing the game and making sure that he stays relevant. He's kept his supporters waiting and America guessing, but it felt like the 2024 election campaign started in Florida last night. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, Orlando.
A hunt is underway for a person believed to be infected with the Brazilian variant of concern after 6 cases were confirmed in the UK, known as P1. The variant shares key mutations with that found in South Africa. Still to be established if the variant makes vaccines less effective. There are currently 6 known cases of the variant in the UK, 3 in the Grampian region of Scotland, 2 in the same household in South Gloucestershire. Further investigation is underway into a 3rd case in England. The whereabouts of this person are unknown, as they didn't complete their test registration cards. Of the cases in Gloucestershire, one of the affected people returned from Brazil to the UK in mid-February, but before the new hotel quarantine measures were introduced. Very pleased to say the Vaccines Minister, Nadhim Zahawi, joins us once again on the programme. Mr Zahawi, always good to see you this morning. And of course, plenty to talk about in terms of the Brazilian variant. But, you know, we do like to mark the milestones on this programme. And another important one has been passed. 20 million people now with the first dose of the vaccine, and some additional funding to coming in soon to ensure that we get all the way there to getting through the adult population, well, just as soon as possible, really.
Yes, Neil, it was an important moment on Sunday, and I have to say credit to the team who don't have a Sunday off. They don't have any day off. They just focus on continuing to deliver the vaccination rollout. We're over 20 million people with the first dose, and we're seeing good early efficacy data in terms of both vaccines, and also, of course, good data from Scotland, from Public Health Scotland, in terms of both vaccines being effective against severe illness and hospitalization. So we keep going. We're focused on the next target, which is the mid-April target to offer the vaccine to 32 million people cumulatively. That is everyone over the age of 50. And then we go on to offer the vaccine to all adults by the end of July. And I'm confident with our supplies and the visibility of deliveries that we will meet those targets.
Can we, though, talk, Minister, about this Brazilian variant? And just before we get into the 6 cases that we've identified here in the United Kingdom, just how much do we know about this variant of concern? Do we have any indication of what the effects of this variant are in terms of transmissibility, in terms of, well, you just mentioned it yourself, vaccine efficacy?
So in terms of its profile, this P1 variant is much closer to the South African variant, which we've been dealing with now for several weeks by surge testing, genome sequencing and isolation. We've had a few hundred of the South African variant, and this variant is a variant of concern. It's very similar in terms of its mutations to the South African variant. So it is concerning. There is one case who the individual didn't fill in their test card details so that we can contact them. If they would probably got a home kit or a test kit from their local authority. And what we're asking today is anyone who had a test on the 12th or 13th of February to contact NHS 119 so that we make sure we identify that individual. And of course, the 2 cases in South Gloucestershire have been isolating. One travelled from Sao Paulo through Zurich to London before the hotel quarantine came in, but they did take a pre-departure test and filled in their forms, the passenger locator form, which is why we're able to deal with them so effectively and work with South Gloucestershire Council, although there's minimal reason to believe that there may be further spread because they have been isolating correctly, but we will be doing asymptomatic testing in South Gloucestershire.
Just in terms of the effect on South Gloucestershire itself, of course, big day next week in terms of, the schools fully reopening. We understand, of course, what can happen if more transmissible variants get into places which serve as vectors for transmission. Is there a possibility that in South Gloucestershire we might not see the schools reopening on Monday?
So the way we've been dealing with the South African variant, this will be very similar in the sense that we surge test and we rapidly isolate and, of course, gene sequence. What we've done with schools is delivered 50 million lateral flow tests so that secondary schools and the teachers in those secondary schools are tested twice a week. There are 4 tests for the students as well before the schools are able to obviously fully bring children back to schools, and all that is taking place as we speak with teachers. And I want to just thank obviously the teaching profession. They've been open all the way through this second or this spike that we've had since December because they've been teaching the frontline healthcare staff, children and those children that are most vulnerable. And the work they're doing is incredibly important. And I'm confident that we'll get all schools reopened on the 8th of March.
Sure. But just in terms of this Brazilian variant and the way in which it got into the country, we have known about its existence for quite some time. We had advice from SAGE on the 21st of January that the only way to prevent new variants from arriving here in the UK was to quarantine all arrivals. The quarantine system didn't kick in until the 15th of February. Isn't it the case that if the government had been rather quicker to introduce that scheme, we might not have seen the Brazilian variant in the community?
Well, if you look at the 2 cases in South Gloucestershire, the case that came in from Sao Paulo through Zurich to the United Kingdom, that case followed exactly the correct procedure, which is the passenger locator form, a pre-departure test already conducted, and then isolated as well. So the regime for our borders is pretty stringent. There are other countries, and we can sort of discuss, say, for example, Australia, who have even more stringent border controls, but they still have variants occurring and have to deal with them. And the way we've been dealing with the South African variants
But
as well.
this was an indirect flight, wasn't it? This was an indirect flight, and we've been asking questions about it on this programme. A number of people on the Conservative benches, the Labour benches, have been warning about it as well. I mean, as things stand, people from Brazil can still get to this country on an indirect flight.
So people from Brazil are banned from coming to this country, even if it's on an indirect flight. If they are UK nationals or residents, then they can. They have to fill in a passenger locator form, which this individual did. They have to take a pre-departure test, which this individual did. They then have to isolate for 10 days and take 2 more tests, a test after 2 days and a test after 8 days. So 3 tests in total. And I think that system in itself is robust, which is why we've been able to locate these 2 cases. And of course, the third is not linked to this, but we need to identify them as well, which is why if you've had a test on the 12th or the 13th of February and haven't had your result back, please get in contact with NHS 119.
I suppose the problem with all of this, Minister, is, people were warning about vague, porous quality at our borders. We had the Health Secretary on the programme on the 4th of February, and I said this, when we still didn't have a date for the quarantine hotels. And as things stand, with the controls we have at the border, with no date for the hotels, isn't it the case that there is a possibility a new, potentially dangerous variant could arrive here in the United Kingdom, bypassing all of the security you've mentioned? Mr Hancock went on to say, we've got very stringent measures in place. The Brazilian variant got here. The stringent measures clearly weren't enough.
So, and that was what I was really trying to get at when I mentioned the Australian border protocols and regime, or New Zealand, that people often quite rightly refer to as sort of best examples of how to do things. They still have challenges with variants actually getting in, and they still have to surge test, do the genome sequencing and isolate in the way we've been doing with the South African variant. I think if you look at this case, actually, if anything, it says that our border controls are pretty robust, because the individual did have a pre-departure test. They did have the passenger locator form, which is why we were able to...
And we've still got one somewhere, potentially, in the community yet to be identified.
Yes, and that's why we need to make sure we find that individual. And we have, obviously, data points that we're going to try and make sure we locate them. And, of course, the reason that we're asking the media to help is to, if anyone who's been tested on the 12th or 13th of this month, of February, forgive me, to come forward if they haven't had their test results back, because the one bit they didn't fill in is their test card, which has their contact details.
Just in terms of what we're expecting this week, of course, big week for the Chancellor, and as always happens, we could spend, 20 minutes speaking to you about what's in the papers this morning, and we're all going to be told we have to wait till Wednesday. So just philosophically, as someone who has a keen interest in business, what do you want to see from the Chancellor this week? I mean, the OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, all suggesting that now is not the time for tax rises, particularly on businesses. What's your view of that?
Well, I think it's important for all of us to wait. It's only another 48 hours till the Chancellor is on...
I'm on tenterhooks, Minister. Come on.
Well, look, I can tell you one thing that I know the Chancellor's been telling business quite rightly, is that our strategy for the recovery from this unprecedented challenge of the COVID pandemic is 3-tiered. One is infrastructure, so a big focus on the infrastructure bank and investing, in big amounts of billions of pounds into infrastructure, especially green infrastructure. The Prime Minister, in his 10-point plan, set us a target that by 2030, every home will be powered by offshore wind. So there's a big push on infrastructure. The second is skills. And you look at the Kickstart scheme, 120,000 places have been created for those who are probably most vulnerable to the COVID challenge, the youngest people who are on the employment ladder or getting on it.
Sure, but just in terms of the corporation tax, and I know you're not going to answer this specifically. But look, you've got any number of companies at the moment looking at whether or not to relocate themselves so that they have better access to the EU market. It's obviously happening. Why would we give them another reason to want to leave the country in the form of a hike in corporation tax?
Well, as I said, look, I can't comment on any taxation announcements, as you can imagine, not least because they would be market sensitive. And of course, it's right that the Chancellor delivers his budget, as is traditionally done, on the 3rd of March, so not long to go. But what I would say is that this country is eminently investable. You look at, in terms of our skills base, our knowledge base. We've demonstrated it obviously through the discovery of the vaccines. And I think this is a great place to come and invest, which is why we still attract, you look at fintech, financial technology, we still attract more investment in this country, I think, than the whole of Europe does in fintech, or at least we're on the top, before someone calls me up on it, the top of the league in terms of attracting fintech investment to the United Kingdom. So I'm very confident that as we come out of this COVID challenge, the economy will bounce back and will be incredibly dynamic, not least helped by Rishi Sunak's budget on Wednesday.
Minister, we will speak again soon, no doubt. Thanks for being on the programme.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's bring in Thomas Moore, our science correspondent, who was listening in to our conversation with the Vaccines Minister. And it appears to be a very dark night wherever Thomas Moore is. I'm wondering if we still have him, or if we can perhaps... we do have him indeed. Hi, Thomas. Morning. Sorry about the technical issues. What did you think about what the Minister had to say? Presumably not about the budget, but about the Brazilian variant.
Yeah, it's interesting that they are reassuring people that we could develop vaccines against this variant, but they are clearly trying to track down this person. They don't know their whereabouts. They don't know whether they are self-isolating. And we know from previous cases of the South African variant, this has jumped from travellers into the community. And you heard there from the Minister that there are now several hundred of the South African variants in the UK. And there will be concern that they want to stop this spreading any further than it has already. And the reason is that this has some of the mutations from existing variants, so the one that gives the transmissibility to the UK variant, but also the one that helps the South African variant to evade the immune system, antibodies from vaccine and previous infection and so on. But it has one more that isn't properly understood, and that is the big concern about this particular variant. We know in Manaus, 3/4 of people were immune to COVID-19, and yet they had such a dreadful surge in January that hospitals were running out of oxygen. These were reinfections. That underlines the concern about this variant and why they're doing everything to try and identify people who may be carrying it.
Thomas, we'll speak again during the show, I'm sure. For now, thanks very much. Plenty coming on the show this morning, in fact, starting with this, a new type of rapid test that will be on trial at Edinburgh Airport. We'll be finding out how it works at 8:20. I'll also be speaking to a father whose son died on a night out 3 years ago, about the annual campaign established in his memory based on random acts of kindness. That's at 9:30.
Hello, art lovers. Time for more studio shenanigans as another contestant gets to drop their penny and pose on the podium.
And at 9:45, the comedian Jenny Eclair joins us to discuss turning 60 and her new Life Drawing series. But ahead of all that, it is the interview that millions of royal watchers around the globe cannot wait to see. Now, a taster for Harry and Meghan's big interview with Oprah Winfrey has been released.
My biggest concern was history repeating itself.
Well, in it, the Prince gives some of his reasons for stepping back and says the process was unbelievably tough.
You've said some pretty shocking things here.
And Sky's royal correspondent Rhiannon Mills joins us on the programme. Morning, Rhiannon. What are we to make of it? Are you at the edge of your seat already?
I'm afraid I am. It's not surprising that the producers of this interview have certainly gone for high drama when it comes to the promotional stuff that they're putting out there, and they have literally pulled out all the stops with this one. One of the promos you hear literally just questions from Oprah, where she says to Meghan, "Were you silent or silenced?" She also talks about the fact that when you say that it was unsurvivable, it sounds like there was some kind of breaking point. You don't actually hear Meghan speak, but the allegations are there within Oprah's questions. We also hear from Prince Harry as well, making some very damning claims about his family when it comes to how his mother was treated. Here's what he has to say.
I'm just really relieved and happy to be sitting here talking to you with my wife by my side, because I can't begin to imagine what it must have been like for her going through this process by herself all those years ago, because it has been unbelievably tough for the two of us, but at least we had each other.
And of course, in the past, we have heard Harry talk about his concern that history was going to repeat itself when it came to the way that Meghan was being treated by the press. But I think it's quite shocking, really, to hear him talking about his mother, and also, I think, making what seems to be quite clear allegations about his family members, that they weren't supportive of his mother. We know that Prince Harry and Prince William have always been very careful when they've talked about their mother's experiences in the past. Also, I think if we were under any doubt as to whether Harry and Meghan were going to be subtle within this interview, I think that kind of clears all of that up. They certainly seem to be pulling no punches, and it is, still a week to go, and still until we hear that interview. This time next week, we will have seen it all, and I suspect we will all be on the edge of our seats.
Thanks, Rhiannon. Well, let's take a look at a couple of the day's other main stories now. And Myanmar's ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi has appeared via video link at a court hearing today, a month after the country's military seized power. Her lawyers say they've been unable to see her despite requests to do so. It follows a weekend of violence in the country, which left at least 18 dead. The Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, says the world continues to face the threat of chemical weapons and warned that people could learn to manufacture them online. His warning comes almost 3 years after the former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, was poisoned in Salisbury with the nerve agent Novichok. And the Governor of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has acknowledged for the first time that some of his behaviour with women may have been misinterpreted as unwanted flirtation. He's facing 2 accusations of sexual harassment and says he will cooperate with an independent investigation led by the state's Attorney General. In a statement, he insisted he had never inappropriately touched or propositioned anyone. The Crown was crowned the winner in a good night for the Brits at the Golden Globe Awards. But those award shows are never completely without controversy, even when they're virtual. The British actor Sacha Baron Cohen criticising a lack of diversity in the Hollywood Foreign Press Association. Our entertainment correspondent Lucy Cotter has the story.
And the Golden Globe goes to The Crown.
British talent reigned supreme in a ceremony which combined the physical and virtual, with Netflix show The Crown winning big at a time when TV has dominated more than ever.
Respect for one another personally, to ask ourselves some of the bigger questions.
Stars battled technology like we all have this year to pick up awards.
Daniel Kaluuya, Judas and the Black Messiah.
I wish I could hear.
Is this on? All right, cool. Can you hear me now?
Most dressing for the occasion, but zooming in from home alone.
Love and appreciation, man. God bless you lot, yeah? I'm just going to go. I'm at the yard alone, bro. Look, I'm at the yard by myself. Nobody to celebrate with. I'm home alone.
Sacha Baron Cohen picked up 2, alluding to the controversy surrounding this year's Globes.
Thank you to the all-white Hollywood Foreign Press.
And although Best Director was awarded to a woman for only the 2nd time ever,
there are no black members of the Hollywood Foreign Press. You got to change that.
Outrage over the globe's lack of diversity and alleged culture of corruption is arguably what people are going to remember. Lucy Cotter, Sky News.
Time to see how the weather is looking this Monday morning. Naz has the detail.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. Today is the first day of the meteorological spring, and it does look fine for many areas. It will feel spring-like in the sunshine and the largely dry conditions, but not everywhere. We have got high pressure dominating the scene once again, so generally speaking, fine and settled for this week, but there will be quite a bit of moisture trapped under that around central and eastern areas in particular this morning. There are fairly extensive patches of mist and fog, and that may linger into this afternoon across some eastern areas where it's probably going to stay quite cloudy and cold. For parts of Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, East Anglia, the Midlands, perhaps even towards eastern parts of Wales are the areas most prone to it lingering. And as you can see, temperatures will only be up into single figures. Elsewhere, we're looking at highs into double figures once we see any other mist and fog patches lift and clear. There will be some good spells of sunshine for Ireland, Northern Ireland, most of Scotland, most of northwest England and the majority of Wales down towards many southern counties of England as well. Still a fairly keen easterly breeze, though, down towards eastern areas, so perhaps a tad breezy there. But it will be mostly fine and mild, as I mentioned. Into tonight, mist, fog and low cloud becomes fairly extensive once again.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Naz, thank you. Coming up after the break, I'll be speaking to a doctor about a campaign to halt what some allege is the quiet privatisation of the NHS by foreign companies.
It's all about numbers, and boy, have we got some interesting ways of showing you what's going on.
Let's take a look at the latest figures.
Most comprehensive ever assessment. Latest analysis by Sky News suggests
that's never happened before. Totally unprecedented.
When you look at this and all the other data, you come to one conclusion.
I think for those of us living with a disability, particularly progressive disability, because I'm deaf and going blind due to Usher syndrome, we already were faced with a series of feeling quite isolated and alone in that journey. And for the pandemic to come along and put extra strain on that has certainly been very testing on the mental health. I certainly didn't feel I could go out and do my essential shopping. As someone who is blind, we can't exercise the 2-meter rule. My guide dog doesn't understand the 2-meter rule. So what happened in effect is I hibernated, and I have been for the past year. I've realised more than ever just how much I really depended on my family and friends to get me out into society and to live an enjoyable life. But yeah, so I can't say we're all alone in that. Of course, we've all struggled, but I think people with disabilities particularly. I think generally, as human nature goes, we tend to be quite selfish people, but I think in a sense, we can hope that people can be more empathetic towards people who do live with everyday isolation, particularly those with Usher syndrome who have a progressive condition. I've lost the majority of my vision already and got 5 degrees vision, and there's nothing that will tell me that I will lose the rest of that or not. So it's hard, but I think in a way, because everyone, whether it's been just situational depression, but everyone has struggled with their mental health. And every person with a disability inevitably will struggle with their mental health. So I do think that there will be some level of empathy from the general population towards people with disabilities after pandemic. Whether or not that lasts, I don't know.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. We help you understand the world with us. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News.
Welcome back. Time, as always, to take a look at the latest coronavirus data for the UK. 6,035 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 were recorded in the last 24 hours. A further 144 have died within 28 days of testing positive, bringing the UK total to 122,849. Meanwhile, just over 20 million first doses of the vaccine have been administered. But of course, a hunt is now underway for a person believed to be infected with the Brazilian variant of concern. After 6 cases were confirmed in the UK. In just the last few minutes, the vaccines minister attempted to offer assurance that the risk the variant is being spread in the community is considered low.
What we're asking today is anyone who had a test on the 12th or 13th of February to contact NHS 119 so we make sure we identify that individual. And of course, the 2 cases in South Gloucestershire have been isolating. One travelled from Sao Paulo through Zurich to London before the hotel quarantine came in, but they did take a pre-departure test and filled in their forms, the passenger locator form, which is why we're able to deal with them so effectively and work with South Gloucestershire Council, although there's minimal reason to believe that there may be further spread because they have been isolating correctly, but we will be doing asymptomatic testing in South Gloucestershire.
And the Shadow Secretary for Work and Pensions, Jonathan Reynolds, joins us once again on the programme. Mr Reynolds, good to see you. And of course, a lot around your brief to discuss ahead of the budget on Wednesday. But can we talk first and foremost about the Brazilian variant, which we now know is in the country? 6 cases, 3 in Scotland, 3 in England. What's the Labour view in all of this? Is it the case that, as Mr Zahawi was telling me just a few minutes ago, actually the way in which they have been able to identify and track 5 of the 6 shows that the system is working?
Well, good morning, Niall. As you know, in my brief, I focus very much on the jobs and employment side of this crisis. But I'll tell you quite honestly, I do not understand, when I look at this crisis, just what the government strategy has been when it comes to the borders, why the airports have been so lax compared to what we all see on television in other countries. And I honestly don't know what the approach has been on that. At the beginning of the crisis, it was almost as if the government was saying, there's no point in trying to put these controls in place. These strains will move around internationally, and that's just what's going to happen, and we've got to track them. But I'm surprised because it always has seemed to me, well, at least for the last 6 months, that the big danger has been a mutant strain that our vaccine rollout, which is fantastic, will not be able to cope with. So for me, I just don't understand why there's been all of these delays in getting a solid quarantine system in place.
Well, I don't want to put words into the minister's mouth, but it struck me that the argument that he was deploying was, well, look at Australia, look at New Zealand, far tougher controls at their borders than we've had, and they've had them for a lot longer, and still variants of concern have emerged there.
Well, still, I look at it and I think if you look at a sensible strategy to control this, especially when test and trace was not delivering the kind of results that we all knew it needed to be able to keep track of those variants. I mean, obviously, I take a close look at the test and trace app in relation to the isolation payments and things like that in my brief, and it would have been overwhelmed if it had been trying to trace new things coming in. So I can't understand it. I think it has to have been more robust on this. To me, the absolute priority has to be making sure we don't get these strains in, because yes, we want to see one tracked when it's in the country, but of course, the nightmare scenario would be one that does get out of control and puts us further back. And this is why there's always been, not a trade-off to me between the economic and health side of this crisis. You've got to look at them together, because if you get the health measures wrong, the economic impact is even greater.
Of course, the Chancellor making his statement at the dispatch box on Wednesday. I wonder what you want to hear from him, and in particular, what is the Labour Party's position on corporation tax? Is any rise over the course of this Parliament something that you would welcome?
Well, what I want to see from the Chancellor on Wednesday is an unrelenting focus on jobs, getting people back to work. I want this to be the economic roadmap to recovery. And I want to see a lot more ambition from the government, particularly on employment, where, to be frank, the government's employment schemes like Kickstart haven't delivered yet. And even if they delivered what the government say they will, it won't be enough, because already we know the unemployment situation is greater than the resources that have been put towards that. So we've got to see more ambition. We want a guarantee for young people in particular to say, you've had a real impact of this crisis. You will not be allowed to be out of work for longer than 6 months will get you education, training, or a job. That should be the guaranteed offer to young people. And on corporation tax, now look, I've been on Sky News many programmes many times arguing that this country would be better off with a slightly higher rate of corporation tax, that it would be still a low level internationally, and if we use that money on better infrastructure, better skills, that would make us more competitive overall. And I still believe that. But would I put corporation tax up in the middle of a crisis, a rise, if the papers are correct, if the leaks are correct, the Chancellor wanted to go from 19 to 25% in one go. Would I do that in a crisis? Absolutely not, because that would be economically illiterate. You've got to have at this moment everything focused on the recovery, everything focused on jobs, and that increases your tax base overall. And that is the way you get back to a sustainable financial position. But to see an increase overnight, right now, in a crisis of this scale, would be completely the wrong position.
All of which is why I was very careful to frame my question in terms of over the course of the Parliament. You're certainly not ruling out corporation tax rises. You wouldn't say that the Labour Party wouldn't want to see any rise in corporation tax over the next 4 years. It's just that right now is not the point that you want it to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So if there's a schedule set out by the Chancellor, well, of course we will look at that. But my concern has always been, I think many colleagues' concern has always been, that the Chancellor might have been looking perhaps not at what's right for the economy, but what's right in political terms for himself. And this leak about trying to raise taxes in the short term so he can say he's cut them before an election, well, that might work for him, but it wouldn't work for the British economy. Right now, the focus has got to be on jobs, getting people back to work. And longer term, that is how we get control of the national finances and put them into a sound position. But an overnight rise in the budget this Wednesday, absolutely not. That would be completely the wrong thing to do. If there's a wider schedule, then of course let's look at that over the longer term.
Jonathan Reynolds, good to see you this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Our political correspondent, Tom Rayner, was listening to that interview. And I suspect the Chancellor might be quite happy, because the suggestion in the papers this morning appears to be, yep, there is a corporation tax rise coming, but it might be just a little bit further down the line.
Yeah, and politically it does put Labour in a slightly tricky position, as was illustrated by that interview, because Jonathan Reynolds saying that he does believe that longer term increasing corporation tax would be a good thing for the country, but just not right now. And basically putting forward an argument in response from the opposition of just not right now is a tricky one. It's a tricky line to walk. What Labour want to say on this is that the focus has to be that unrelenting focus on jobs and on protecting the economy, and that taxes is not what they need to see right now. But clearly, Labour ultimately want to see the taxes increased to support the state. So it's a tricky balance, and you can see that, I think, in that interview.
I think you can. Tom, thanks very much indeed. Now, a coalition of doctors and campaigners have written a letter urging the Health Secretary to investigate claims of privatisation of the NHS by stealth by a US company. The group, Keep Our NHS Public, are campaigning against the merger of the UK's biggest GP practice operator with US health insurance group Centene Corporation, which is set to have 58 practices under its watch. Well, let's speak now to the GP and Chair of Doctors in Unite, Dr. Jackie Appleby, who's joining us now. Dr. Appleby, lovely to have you on the programme this morning. Just how much of an issue is this? How much of our health services currently being parcelled up and sold off, in your view?
It's a massive issue, and it's been going on under the radar for years and years. And we're always told that the NHS isn't being privatised, but this is more evidence that, in fact, it is. And this, a massive, giant US health corporation have got their feet now under the table of UK general practice. And what this means is that, unlike your traditional GP, we all are funded, we get a fixed budget to provide services, and we invest all of that money into our services. And so GPs effectively paying themselves a salary out of that fixed budget. But organisations like this, they have shareholders. They have to generate a profit to provide dividends to their shareholders. The only way you can do that from general practice is by cutting costs. So cutting costs involves cutting staff costs, so increasing skill mix, having less doctors, and this then knocks on to services for patients. So it's a really big problem. And I think during COVID as well, I mean, we've seen how contracts go to private companies for things like PPE, with very little scrutiny. And I really worry that with the new leaked white paper, that they say that competition will be a thing of the past in the NHS, which would be great if the NHS was the provider. But if the contracts are going to go without scrutiny to private companies such as Centene, we will be sort of down the spiral into a US healthcare system.
Yeah, Doctor, just on that point, I mean, clearly a lot of people have become focused on this particular issue because of Centene links to US healthcare and US health insurance. But actually, I mean, AT Medics, the company the organisation which they are taking over, made £35 million in profit over the last 5 years. And this is a company that was set up by 6 NHS GPs, 37 GP practices across 49 sites in London. I mean, even without the influence of American healthcare companies, this is something that people will be both surprised and shocked about, I'd say.
Yes, and all those millions are millions that are not being invested in patient care, and they should be being invested in patient care. And the NHS belongs to the people, and it was brought in place of fear in 1948 so that people could get the care they needed when they needed it. And if millions of pounds are being siphoned off into the pockets of individuals and into shareholders, and it's absolutely shocking. I mean, in the general practice where I work, all of the fixed budget that we are provided with goes into providing patient services, and this is exactly how it should be.
And Dr. Appleby, just before we run out of time, as we often do on this programme, how are you and all of your colleagues doing at the practice at the moment?
We're okay, thank you. I mean, we are, it's hard, it's tough, it's a huge logistical challenge, but we're getting the vaccine rolled out, and, we're hopeful that even with the variants, this is going to make a big difference. Thank you.
Keep up the good work. Dr. Appleby, thanks so much for joining us in the programme.
Thank you.
Still to come on the programme this morning, from champions to non-existence overnight. No, nothing about Celtic. Instead, a curious tale from the world of Chinese football.
I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
If there is a bigger explosion, this area would be in the danger zone.
These traffic jams snake for hours up and down this hillside. It means precious aid can't access those in need. You can see the depth of the water. If you have a look in front of us, there are people wading through it. I think experiencing the 2 million person march in Hong Kong, that was a moment.
I don't like the Chinese government. It's cruel.
It was real people power in action.
Police have been firing tear gas and rubber bullets.
See fires all around us here, and just one of them is the size of around 31,000 football pitches.
Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Bangkok.
For the early risers.
As we examine the story beyond the headline.
For the knowledge seekers.
Welcome to Divided States.
For the straight talkers, the curious, and the ones who want to be entertained.
Backstage, Sky News' entertainment podcast.
For wherever you are.
Welcome to Sophie Ridge on Sunday podcast.
For the ones who want to know more.
Welcome to the All Out Politics podcast.
For the listeners.
From Sky News Storycast.
Sky News Podcasts. Listen and subscribe for free.
Did you know that reducing pollution outside of school can help stop toxic air getting trapped in our classrooms?
Most places will be dry today with bright or sunny spells, except across central and eastern parts of England and Wales, where mist, fog and low cloud will linger. So taking a look at the air pollution levels today on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being very high, many areas will be at a low level 1 to 3. However, there is a chance of some pockets of moderate air pollution at levels 4 to 6, mainly across eastern areas where the fog lingers today.
The Air Quality Report, sponsored by Philips Air Purifiers.
Let's conclude there with a bit of a thought experiment. Imagine if your football team had won the league, fulfilling all the fans' wildest dreams, but then inexplicably disbanded overnight. Well, that's what's happened in China. The Super League winners, Jiangsu FC, have announced that the club has ceased all operations with immediate effect. What on earth is going on there? Well, joining us now, Dati Raftinson, former assistant coach to the Jiangsu women's team, and clearly will have a view in all of this. Dati, thank you so much for joining us in the programme this morning. We've had any number of problems, financial problems, big clubs with financial problems here, but winning and then going out of business overnight, I mean, that's quite something. Tell us exactly what's happened here.
Yeah, so you learn quickly in China football that nothing can come as a surprise anymore. But what has happened has nothing to do with football. So in China, football is not grassroots or bottom up like it's normally is in Europe. It's a top-down affair. So big corporations like Suning, which is one of the biggest companies in China, they operate these clubs sort of at the goodwill of the government, of the local government. And what's happened is that the corporation has run into debt repayment problems, and they have to get rid of what they don't consider as core business, which football isn't. It's sort of like a mix of Walmart, Amazon, PayPal. They have cell phone operators, so it's a huge company that is now running into problems that has nothing to do with football, and this is what they've come up with.
I have to ask then, I wonder what the players, both men and women, what the prospect is for them of having, a career with the club.
So I've actually heard from a couple of players, both sides, and it's come obviously as a shock. So most of them will be looking for new clubs. But what will probably happen is that, like normally in China, somebody else will take over the operations. But it's a shame with Suning because they've invested a lot in football in Jiangsu, and Jiangsu is actually a traditional Chinese football powerhouse. So they've actually run a pretty impressive ship. It was very professional to work for them, and a lot of professional people who were running the organization. So they had a huge youth program. They had one of the best funded women's teams in the world when I was over there, and they've actually won the title in 2019. So somebody else will take over, but it remains to be seen if they can continue at the same level of operations.
There is a connection with Inter, isn't there, with Inter Milan? Any prospect that might serve as something of a lifeline, or is it just as you say that it's likeliest that we're just going to see some other corporate conglomerate coming in and taking straight over?
Well, that's the news from Italy, is that they have been seeking investment for the Inter part of the business, and that's actually like a jewel in the crown, and something that they would probably want to keep a hold of. But if they can't finance the operations, they'll probably be, looking to get in new investors or sell it off.
Dati, clearly China is a huge market for football, the domestic consumption, of course, but also, football overseas being shown there. Is there any risk that the collapse of Jiangsu puts at risk, domestic football in China? It strikes me probably not, just because they've got quite a lot of people and quite a lot of money.
Yeah, like I said earlier, nothing comes as a surprise. So, they'd probably be up and running in a different form sooner than you'd think. But Chinese football has changed a lot in the last 10 years. So China is trying to build football from the grassroots and up to the professional clubs to be able to compete on the global level. So it's a combination of being a business venture as well as being a political venture, because China wants to use football to show that, when they're able to have success at the highest level in the World Cup or players in Europe, that they will be, it's a geopolitical issue. So it's an issue of arriving on the world stage. So they will figure it out somehow. I'm quite sure of that.
And of course, at some point in the future, China clearly wants to be China wants to dominate in pretty much everything. But in terms of football, might just be a couple of years yet before they're top of the FIFA rankings.
Yeah, at least a couple of years and maybe even a couple of decades. But the speed of everything and when they get into it, they do it quickly and they do it impressively. But it might take a couple of decades to get where they want to be.
Certainly might. Dati Raffenson, great to have you on the programme this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Time for us to have a look at the weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Good morning. Today is the first day of the meteorological spring, and it does look like it is going to be a spring-like day for many areas, and that's thanks to high pressure keeping it fine still, and in fact for much of this week. But nights will be chilly, there will be frosts, and there will be some fog as well. In fact, this morning, there's frosty conditions across many northern and western areas with a few patches of mist and fog, but the fog is really quite extensive across many parts of England and Wales, particularly dense across some eastern areas, parts of Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, the East Midlands, seeing visibility down to around 50 metres. And most of the mist and fog will lift and clear, but some of it is likely to linger, I think, into this afternoon, particularly those areas I mentioned around areas of East Anglia as well. So as a result, many central and eastern parts will still remain quite dull this afternoon and feeling quite cold as a result with that lack of sunshine. Elsewhere, there will be brighter sunny spells developing for most of Ireland, Northern Ireland, the majority of Scotland, northwest England, most of Wales and southern counties of England. A bit breezy still across the south, particularly along the south coast, perhaps making it feel a little cooler, but it will still be mild for many areas in the sunshine. Again, tonight, we see the return of mist and fog.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.